I don't think you will find European powers being interested in setting themselves up for an aggressive war in which they seek to take territory. And that provides a whole range of options for a more high-tech approach to warfare, which I think that European societies will find easier to tolerate. It's not actually Russia. Russia's behavior hasn't actually changed in the past year or so. The big challenge comes from America. And I think 35 years ago, when the Cold War ended, European governments had an opportunity then to stop relying on the USA for their security, and they didn't take it. I hope they take it this time.
Hello everyone, my name is Eugeniusz Romer and this is the YouTube channel of Układ Sił, a foreign policy magazine from Poland. And today we are in a very special place because we are in Stockholm, actually at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, known as CIPRI. And I have a great pleasure to interview the director of this institute, Mr. Dan Smith. Hello.
Hi.
Good morning. And we are in Sweden, obviously. So do you think in the current international environment, Sweden is a safe country?
Relatively speaking, yes. There's no 100% safety and security to be had anywhere. I think that the situation globally has become more risky in the past few years. Tensions have increased, confrontations have deepened, there's more division. And then I think in particular in the region there are more and more concerns now about the security situation, especially about Russia after the escalation of the war in Ukraine beginning in February 22. So I think, you know, as long as you don't by safety mean that there is no risk of anything bad ever happening to anyone, yeah, Stockholm, Sweden, still relatively safe places. Good places to live and bring up a family.
So what made Sweden join the NATO alliance recently? Why the Swedish authorities made that decision?
I think it's very clear that it was a very quick reaction to the escalation of the war in Ukraine when Russia launched its full-scale invasion. I mean, after all, there had already been almost 8 years of war in Ukraine since Russia had taken Crimea and parts of the eastern Donbass. But then there was the escalation with the full invasion in February 22. And I think that that moved more or less everybody's perception of security issues into a different phase, a different stage. And I think that it became then very quickly a moment where Swedish authorities and Swedish public opinion started to think about Sweden's role in the world and in Europe and what Sweden needed for its security in a different way. So I had been in Sweden for 7 years almost by that time. And there was a debate all the time about Sweden joining NATO. But the advocates of Sweden joining NATO had a problem, which is a timing problem. If there were a crisis with Russia, would Sweden join NATO then? No, because it would make the crisis worse. So if there were no crisis with Russia, would Sweden join NATO? No. Why would you? But what the Russian leadership, what Vladimir Putin did with the escalation of the war in Ukraine was to sort of blow right past that logic. Now there was no longer an issue of timing. I think it was also especially an important factor in Sweden that Finland went in. Finland reacted even more quickly than Sweden. They have a 1,200-kilometer long border with Russia. They were obviously thinking about that. They have a history with Russia of conflict, which is more recent than Sweden's history. And Finland, therefore, very clearly was going in, and Sweden started to think about Nordic solidarity. And so that was also a reason to go in. So there was the feeling of being a European power, that was in the background all the time. There was the escalation of the sense of Russian threat, and there was the positive aspect of Nordic solidarity.
So if Russia is one of the main reasons, or Russia's actions, do you think that the Nordic countries, including Sweden, they share the same fears as the Eastern NATO flank countries like Poland, the Baltic countries, or Romania?
I think it's a nuanced yes and no in answer to that question. No, because, well, first of all, because the Nordic countries have different relationships with Russia and with the question of, or with the issue of a Russian threat. Norway, of course, has a very small common border with Russia. Denmark is differently positioned. If you include Iceland as a Nordic country, it's yet further away with other issues. Secondly, I think that the Nordic countries, perhaps Finland is relatively closer to the perceptions in the Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, and perhaps also Poland, of what the experience of Russia is and was during the 20th century, and what perceptions and expectations that sets up. I think Sweden, it's rather different because it's an older history. But then I think that, yes, there is a lot of sense of a shared space, shared problems, shared challenges, and shared worries and concerns about Russia. They can take different forms from time to time, but for all of us, the big challenge is, how do we in Europe live alongside Russia with tolerably peaceful relations? We don't have to love each other. We certainly don't want to be dominated and experience the peace of the graveyard. But how do we have something that you could call coexistence, living next door to this big, unavoidable neighbor?
Yeah, peace, as in graveyard, it doesn't sound possible, actually, I think, in Europe, but many people use the phrase peace through strength. So do you think that Eastern flank with Nordic countries can achieve that? And what are the common grounds for cooperation? As far as I know, Sweden has a very strongly developed military industry, and we need weapons, actually. We don't know how it's going to work between us and the US, which is the main supplier of the weapons to Poland now, but it may change because of the trade war. So do you think there is a field for strong cooperation between our countries or our regions?
Well, I think if you look at the European reaction, the reaction of European governments to the new developments coming out of Washington in the last few months, what you see is the attempt to find greater unity and closer cooperation on the very big, broad questions of what position to take, what should Europe be doing in the world, how to support Ukraine, but also other issues. It's going to happen on climate change as well. The European governments have a wholly different position from the one which is taken by the Trump administration. So I think there's all sorts of ways in which you will see European governments wanting to move more closely together. Now, in terms of the military sector, European states, or Europe, let's say, generalizing, feels in an insecure position in relation to Russia. Sometimes this is because we think in terms of individual states and the individual states' relationship to this big neighbor. Indeed, I mean, in Estonia, Latvia or Lithuania, small countries on the border of Russia, why would you not feel insecure when you look over your eastern shoulder at them? But those three countries are also a part of Europe. And Europe as a whole, the EU, and especially if you add in the UK, spends far more than Russia does on the military. So if we then feel insecure, there is a question not just of how much money we spend, but how we spend it. And in particular, there's the question of what are the transaction costs through having all of these 28 or so separate sovereign states, separate armed forces, separate systems of command. Is there a gain to be found through much closer cooperation, as between the military forces sharing commands, as between the ministries of defense unifying their procurement policies, maybe even unifying their staffing? So I think that there's a lot that can be done, as I say, in terms not just of how much money to spend, but how to spend that money, how to organize it. And I think that Europe will go in that more unified, more cooperative direction, though I would guess that there will always be inefficiencies.
And do you think that this is only about money? Because actually when you think about military issues, you need the equipment, of course, but you need someone to actually use this equipment, right? So and it requires people going to war, people doing military trainings in the peacetime, and it's something that harms your economy sometimes. It's something that threatens your populations, and I think many politicians are afraid of doing this because it might undermine their political stance. So do you think that Europe, which spends more money for defenses than Russia, would like to actually take part in this how to say, in this race with Russia when it comes to the strategic ladder?
I'm sure that we will find that there is a different appetite for this in different countries. Some countries have a very strong martial tradition and will probably find it relatively straightforward to do so. It won't imply such a big shift for them. Others, maybe either it's a big change or a change which they refuse to make. I mean, Poland has opted for a dramatic increase in the spending and the proportion of the economy which is directed towards the military and in the number of people who will be serving in Polish armed forces. I doubt you will find other countries taking such a radical stance. But I think that what I think you will never find from any European government is an appetite to fight a war in the way that Russia has been fighting in Ukraine. These meat grinder tactics that take an awful lot of human sacrifice in order just to make 100 meters of ground. That's where the war in Ukraine is like the First World War, with thousands of people, I mean, in the case of the First World War, tens of millions of people losing their lives for almost no gain in each offensive. I don't think that you will find European powers being interested in setting themselves up for that kind of war. But also, I don't think you will find European powers being interested in setting themselves up for an aggressive war in which they seek to take territory. And that provides a whole range of options for a more high-tech approach to warfare, which I think that European societies will find easier to tolerate, depending then, it's not all about the money, but depending then coming back to the money. The real problem is, in order to defend your country successfully, or in order to be in a position where you believe you can successfully defend your country, what's the cost you're willing to pay in terms of the quality of life in your country? I mean, you can fund the increase in military spending by borrowing, okay, through economic growth, which is probably not going to be happening right now on the scale that people want, by raising taxes, which carries its own problems, and by reallocating money from other purposes like education, health, and of course overseas aid, which is already happening.
So which scenario is most probable for Europe? Because we've heard that Germans, they changed their constitution in order to borrow more money for infrastructure, but also for defense purposes, but in countries like France or Italy, it's a huge problem because their debt is more than one, in terms of GDP, more than 100%. So do you think, how do you think, which way is the most probable?
Well, obviously, both with the German decision and with the EU decision, there's going to be some borrowing, and it looks like the UK will also adjust its policy on borrowing, the so-called borrowing targets. But I worry that at a time when health and education spending in several countries has not really been quite high enough to meet the needs of today and tomorrow, that there will be a sense that that has to be still further restrained. And I don't think that that leads to a crisis in either health or education in the next 4 or 5 years. But you have to invest in the long term in these things. So I think maybe in the 2030s there's more of a problem. The big alternative for me is that taxation should be increased. And I think that that's fairly obviously the path that needs to be taken. It will perhaps take some time before there is a consensus to be doing that amongst the European elites who don't want to be taxed more than they are at the moment. But, you know, they're doing fine. They can afford a little bit more in taxation. And I think for the European security establishment, the big challenge is really, this may sound paradoxical, it's not actually Russia. Russia's behavior hasn't actually changed in the past year or so. The big challenge comes from America, because they have been quite clear in the Trump administration. They've been really very clear and explicit. They do not want Europe to rely on the USA for its security. To be frank, nor do I. And I think 35 years ago, when the Cold War ended, European governments had an opportunity then to stop relying on the USA for their security, and they didn't take it. I hope they take it this time. But it is probable that in order to be able to take it, then there is going to have to be an increase in taxation. And I think one of the interesting things in European politics in the next 3 to 5 years is going to be the discussion around exactly that issue.
I will ask you some questions about the US, or a lot of questions about the US in a bit, but my final question about European industry in terms of defense is, do you think that pouring some money into this sector may actually be a source of growth? Because right now I think the Rheinmetall company is already more expensive than Volkswagen, the main car producer in Germany, which was the pearl of German industry. So maybe some countries, they see a chance here. They will shift their manufacturing powers into defense industry, and they will earn money because of the less secure situation globally.
I think, first of all, I think that there are companies and investors who see that possibility. Secondly, I think that there is little doubt that if you develop the arms industry in Germany, the UK, France, Italy, Poland, Sweden, wherever, that does provide jobs and it creates profits. So it could be, especially in these current economically uncertain times, that there is some contribution to economic growth which comes out of that. Historically, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, the long-term picture was that high spending on the military was associated with lower levels of economic growth, because part of what happens is that in some sense, technically and scientifically, the best brains get attracted into the military sector where there are safe profits to be had, rather than into the new, more innovative sectors where there are less safe but greater profits to be had, and where there is less modest, sometimes there's a risk, but more spectacular economic growth. So I think that in the long term, a heavy reliance onto military technology, it may be necessary, it may be deemed to be necessary from a security point of view, but it is not the best economic policy. The best economic policy would would include some military technology, but it's really to be investing in other high-tech industries and in infrastructure.
So coming back to the current administration of the United States of America, so do you think that actually the US really wants Europe to be totally independent from the US in terms of security? Because that would also mean that Brussels would be more assertive towards Washington, could have maybe different relations with China, which is also a rival of the United States. So do you think that they really want us to be independent, or maybe dependent in some sectors, like high tech? You mean you meant reconnaissance and this kind of military activity, but also spend more so the Americans don't have to deploy their troops here?
I think that the driving ideas behind the Trump administration and its policy towards Europe have not been fully thought through on exactly that line of inquiry that you just asked about. Since the Second World War, Western Europe and then Central and Eastern flank countries, their security has been dependent on the USA. And this has been a part of the general predominance of US power and influence. And there have been many dimensions to that. There's been the soft power of Hollywood and television and so on as well. There's been the hard power of the military. There's been the economic levers of influence and so on. And these have been very strong, and I think in the view of most everybody outside of the USA, this system has benefited the US. So if the US has spent more on Europe's defense than Europe has, okay, from perspective of American self-interest, I would say they were paying a price and they got a whole lot from that. Donald Trump and other co-thinkers in the US, and he is far from alone in this, do not think that. It used to be the case that there were many Democrats who didn't think it. So during the 1970s, for example, every year there was the so-called Mansfield Amendment, named after Senator Mike Mansfield, who was always putting up an amendment to bring American troops home from Europe. And it never happened because there were so many American interests in having such large forces in Europe. So now I think that exactly what you're asking is right. Do they actually recognize that by pushing Europe towards greater independence in the security field, they will encourage Europe towards greater independence in other things as well, especially if they start slapping high tariffs on European exports to the USA,
which they have already started, right?
Exactly. So I think, as I say, I think it is not a completely thought through approach. They're not taking a truly holistic or organic view of what American power and advantage and influence really are. And this seems to be part of the way in which the administration thinks. It's very segmented. If you think of, they just look at the security component, they don't look at other aspects. They just, within the security component, they just look at what they pay to have US forces in Europe. They don't look at what benefits that might provide for their own security. And in the same way on trade, they just look at tariffs in a very narrow way, and they look at bilateral trade. So they don't think of global trade as a system in which you sell more of this and you buy more of that and somebody else has something else and so on. No, they think they think in the basis, do we sell Canada more than Canada sells us? No,
Or
well then that's
third
wrong.
island, right?
Yes, I mean that. Well, with the penguins, that's really just plain silly.
Yeah. So you, in your research, you focus on identity politics, on nationalism. So what do you think? Maybe Donald Trump is a hostage of his own rhetorics, of his own internal politics, because he and his allies like Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance, they in this campaign they said a lot about the globalization, how it hurt, American industry, how letting China, for example, to the WTO changed the labor prices and moved the industry to Asian countries. So maybe he has to do it because he promised it to the people who live in a Rust Belt, for example, in the US.
Well, I think that there are some aspects of what they have said about America's economic history which are true. So letting China into the World Trade Organization, and China has bent and evaded, interpreted creatively some aspects of WTO regulations. Many people think that who do not think that the tariffs are right. So that has been an issue, and it's certainly the case that since the early 1980s, a number of different measures taken by the US and then also by China have meant that China's role in world manufacturing has changed, I mean, dramatically compared to 40, 45 years ago. So that's for real. Has globalization hurt Americans? Yes, it has. There are some Americans who have really suffered from that. The jobs have gone from their location in the USA. First of all, they shifted southwest into the Sun Belt from the Rust Belt, and then they shifted out from there, you know, across the border to Mexico and further away. Globalization has also hurt a lot of ordinary people, citizens in Europe. Has it also benefited many Americans? Yes, it's benefited Americans hugely. It's given them cheaper goods to buy in a mass market, and it's made some Americans unbelievably rich. So the system, I mean, in one sense, economically, socially, the system is unfair. There are winners and losers, there are rich and poor, and the world has been becoming more and more unequal under through the drivers of globalization. That it could be managed differently, but it hasn't been. But somehow to blame all of that onto tariffs or Canadians or the Chinese, no, this is a global system which has run in this way, and there are winners and losers in it. If you want to increase the number of winners in it, it's perfectly possible. You don't have to throw all the cards up in the air as they have just done.
So coming back to discussing the strategic implications of this situation, in which sectors of the security or strategy are European countries dependent still on the US heavily? Is it satellite reconnaissance, for example, or nuclear deterrence, or what kind of fields actually, which capabilities we have to build to be fully independent and secure?
Well, there's two questions which you're asking there. One is on what are the aspects of European dependence upon the USA for security, and the second question is which areas would we have to build, because it's not necessarily a neat match. It is true that if one takes nuclear deterrence seriously as being the ultimate guarantor of European security, then Europe depends on the US for nuclear deterrence, and the UK, which claims to provide an independent deterrent force, depends on the US for its forces. France is the only independent nuclear power in Europe, west of Russia. For intelligence, there is a considerable amount of dependence on the US, but probably not quite as great as some people think, partly because the UK plays a major role in global intelligence cooperation with the USA, and partly also because satellite technology has now moved to a state or to a level that it ought to be possible if Europe wants to be developing more its own capacities in that area. I think in aerospace technology and so on, Europe utilizes a lot of American technology, which in many respects is advanced compared to what Europe can provide, but it's not a massive gulf. And the biggest problem is actually not the level of the technology, but the capacity of the industries. And that's the same in ammunition. There's no real difference in terms of the levels of the technology, but in terms of the capacity of the industry, that's where Europe has a deficiency.
So should we build more factories where we can produce, for example, artillery shells and ammunition? Because as far as I know, the Russians, they use about 10,000 pieces every day, and even they don't have such capabilities. They take it, for example, from North Korea. So in case of the full-scale war between NATO, European allies, and Russia, we would be in a bad situation. So do you think that this is an issue and we should be thinking about it very quickly?
I think in slightly more general terms than saying artillery shells, I think, yes, it is something which has to be thought about very quickly and decisions taken on how and what capacity to build up. I would not be myself able to say, and it ought to be artillery shells, or it ought to be short-range missiles, or it ought to be longer-range missiles, or it should be rather manned aircraft or drones. I mean, there is an array of different military capabilities. And I think that an odd thing which we're learning from the Ukraine war is that while, for example, artillery has, as you said, the Russians are using a phenomenal number of shells every day, but at the same time they're being held back by Ukrainian forces whose rate of fire with artillery shells is much, much lower in general. From time to time it's got a little bit closer, but mostly it's much lower. But that's because they're using newer technologies, including the drones. So yeah, I'm not quite sure what the mix will be, but I think that the military industrial capacity in Europe needs to be probably expanded, yeah.
And many experts, they say that the European defense industry is very dispersed, and it doesn't have big companies. It has relatively small companies that produce equipment mostly for outside of the EU. The customers are outside our continent. So do you think we need to actually make some bigger companies, make them bigger in order to secure our needs?
I'm not an expert on industrial policy, but I would think that if governments step in to create bigger companies, there can be an awful lot of mistakes and inefficiencies along the way. And I would rather a situation in which the governments are basically saying, well, here is the market. Here is the demand or the requirement as we see given our security strategy. Here is how we want to unify and align our procurement policies in order to achieve the most impact. And the industry and the corporate executives and decision makers there say, well, here is the best way in which we can meet that demand, and then everybody's happy.
Maybe regarding industry, one more question. How about hypersonic missiles? Because the Russians, they have them. For example, Oryeshnik, the latest one, but also Typhoon or Kinzhal, for example. And many experts say that using those rockets, those missiles, they would be able to paralyze our decision-making site centers, or paralyze our energy infrastructure, or I don't know, roads, railways, and so on. So do you think we need to develop something to respond to this threat? Maybe countering systems, or I don't know, parallel systems that could be also destructive for the Russians?
I think it's undoubtedly the case that hypersonic missiles are going to be developed on all sides. The British have, I think, recently tested one and claimed a successful test out of it. So I think that is going to happen. I don't think that it always makes sense to say that, well, the adversary has this capability and therefore we need to have the same capability. But I think that to a degree that is going to happen. But the real response to problems that could be generated by the Russians having hypersonic missiles is to attempt to make the infrastructure aspects that what you're most worried about, decision-making, energy infrastructure, maybe transport hubs, to make them more resilient, to provide some degree of maybe point defenses for them, but also protection, burying them, making them more secure, dispersing them so that there are redundant systems in energy and infrastructure that can help.
And regarding Ukraine, do you think that peace is achievable in a relatively quick time span? And do you think that European forces should be peacekeeping actually this possible treaty between Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, there's so much of imagining different scenarios and looking into crystal balls to try to answer that and think about that. I think there is perhaps a greater possibility now than many people are assuming that there could be something that is maybe a bit more than a ceasefire agreement, even if it's not completely a sustainable peace settlement. And the reason why I think that is because I think that in an indirect way, the trade war that President Trump may be unleashing at the moment, and after all, we don't know if he will change course in 1, 2, 3 weeks' time or whatever. Nothing is predictable. But if those tariffs stay, and if the really negative prognoses of many economists turn out to be true, then this will also hit Russia, not least because the oil price is plummeting. And the price of Urals oil is now just above $53 a barrel, and their budget was set at just under $70 a barrel. So it's a huge hit for the Russian war effort to take. If that's the case, then it could be that President Putin, although he will doubtless mask this with all kinds of rhetoric and vocabulary, it could be that President Putin becomes more interested in actually achieving an end to the fighting. I don't think that that would be a peace settlement that President Zelensky would think was fair, that returned all of the territory and so on, but there might be a possibility for an agreement. And if that agreement was on terms which Zelensky could accept, even if provisionally, even if holding his nose as he did so, then I think European forces would need to be deployed in order to ensure that it would be kept and in order to monitor it. They would be there in order to secure the ceasefire or truce or whatever it would be called at the time, and to act as a very clear message to Putin that any attempt to make a similar step in the future would have really much worse consequences. Putin is going to resist that, and that could be a deal breaker, who knows. But I think that the agreement would not be viable without European forces being present.
So how should we treat such forces in this scenario as tripwire forces? Because this is what leaders of countries like the UK or France say they should consist of about, I don't know, 40,000 troops, and the Russians are going to develop the army up to 1 million in 2027. So it's uncomparable. So what is going to be the exact role of those forces?
I think, first of all, that the role of tripwire forces should not be underestimated. Britain, France, and the USA only ever had tripwire forces in West Berlin, all through the Cold War. Secondly, I think that they would probably be there primarily for monitoring the border. And I am assuming, and this is unfortunate, but the border would need to be hardened. So it would therefore be a much greater challenge for Russia to be doing anything about it. And I wouldn't worry particularly about the numbers. I think the 30 to 40,000 would be a credible force, a credible presence that shows that Europe is bringing Ukraine into Europe as a whole, supporting it properly to do that. And after all, Ukrainian defense will carry on being provided primarily by Ukrainian forces. And does President Putin think it'll be easy? No.
Yeah, because my final question is about the role of Ukraine in the future if peace is achieved. Because Donald Trump, he also presents a deal to President Zelensky, and this deal would mean that any European activities in Ukraine would be blocked because the American companies will have priority in all the investments regarding, for example, natural resources. So do you think that Ukraine will join the European Union and will be able to develop it in terms of economy? So it's going to also strengthen its military.
Yes, it's a very big question. You didn't include in it the question of whether Ukraine can join NATO. I think that it's almost certain, in my view, that the main European governments who are leading the push at the moment will want to have some kind of security arrangement, security agreements with Ukraine. If the USA insists those must be outside of NATO, then that's fine. They will be outside of NATO. The UK had agreements with Sweden and Finland, and there was a joint expeditionary force from 2014 that had NATO and non-NATO and EU and non-EU in it, and by all reputes a relatively good experience for developing forces and developing cooperation. So I don't think that it is essential, or maybe it's not even helpful, to be thinking all the time about, well, can Ukraine join NATO or can Ukraine join EU? I think the most important thing is there a relationship that helps Ukraine with security if and when, well, even before peace or of any kind can be secured, but if and when it can be secured? And is there a relationship with Ukraine which helps it recover economically from the war? I think that President Trump has made it pretty clear that he's not really interested in that. He's interested in the extraction of raw materials, which I think is being overstated. What is available from Ukraine, or how easily that is available, because there is a lot of work that would need to be done to exploit their main mineral deposits. So I think this is something where one can envisage that the USA and Europe will diverge, will take completely different paths, where the USA will probably have to be either implicitly, if not explicitly, providing some kind of, as it's been put, backdrop to security for Ukraine. And to that extent, I think that President Trump is partially right, that the presence of American companies and American economic activity in Ukraine will contribute to that end.
Yeah, we will see that.
Many other things we will see. I have never known a period of such uncertainty.
So I think it's hard times for experts like you, because you need to be on time up to date all the time, and you have a lot of journalists asking you questions. So thank you very much for your time and for this very comprehensive interview. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
So I was interviewing Dan Smith, the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in Sweden. Many thanks to our viewers as well. Goodbye.